The dirty water hit her face in slow motion, cold, reeking of bleach and motor oil. As Victoria Hayes stood frozen in her anniversary dress, while her sister-in-law Margaret laughed and her mother-in-law Patricia raised her champagne glass in mock celebration. The bucket clattered to the marble floor of the penthouse she'd secretly purchased 3 years ago, the sound echoing through rooms her husband Daniel believed his family's connections had secured for them, connections that had never existed outside Victoria's carefully orchestrated illusion. 5 years of marriage, 5 years of playing the grateful wife who'd married up into the Hayes family, and this was her anniversary gift. Divorce papers signed by Daniel, a smirking mistress named Jessica standing in her dining room. And now humiliation drenched into her designer dress that cost more than Margaret's annual salary. The water dripped from Victoria's hair onto the floor in rhythmic drops, each one a second closer to the moment when everything would change, each one washing away another layer of the mercy she'd been clinging to for months. Patricia's laughter cut through the silence, that sharp sound Victoria had endured through countless family dinners where she'd been introduced as Daniel's little charity case, never knowing that the woman they mocked approved every Hayes family paycheck at Summit Global Industries from a concealed office on the 47th floor. Daniel stood beside Jessica with his arms crossed, his face arranged in that expression of righteous superiority he wore so well, explaining how Victoria needed to sign the papers and leave with dignity because Jessica was already pregnant and he needed to do the right thing. The dirty water had soaked through to Victoria's skin now, cold against the warmth she'd been feeling all day, the warmth of the secret growing in her own belly, the child she'd planned to announce tonight over the anniversary dinner that was now destroyed. Margaret was recording on her phone, narrating for social media about putting gold diggers in their place, capturing evidence she didn't realize would soon bury her, broadcasting to 3,000 followers who had no idea they were watching a trillionaire being degraded in her own property. As something shifted in Victoria's eyes as the last drop of dirty water fell from her chin. Not anger exactly, closer to clarity, the kind that comes when you finally stop protecting people from themselves. Daniel noticed the change, and his confidence flickered for just a second before he reinforced it, demanding she sign the papers without making a scene, threatening to call security to remove her from his family's home. But Victoria's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile as she reached into her purse, her hand moving past the unsigned divorce papers and the positive pregnancy test, searching for something else entirely. Patricia moved closer, ready to escalate the cruelty, unaware that the phone in Victoria's hand contained access codes to accounts that could erase the Hayes family from existence with a few keystrokes. Margaret's recording continued, capturing the moment before the earthquake, the last seconds of a world that was about to shatter so completely that Daniel would spend the next year shaking in fear, bankrupt and broken, finally understanding what he'd kicked out on their anniversary. The question wasn't whether Victoria would destroy them. The dirty water had already answered that. The question was whether any of them would survive what came next, and whether a man who'd chosen his mistress over his pregnant wife could even comprehend the magnitude of the empire he'd just declared war against. What this story reveals, this narrative will expose how arrogance and cruelty create their own destruction, how power hidden becomes power amplified, and how the worst betrayals often come from those who understand you least. Viewers will witness the transformation from victim to victor, learn about the psychology of revenge versus justice, and discover why underestimating people based on appearances is the most expensive mistake anyone can make. And the story teaches that dignity isn't about accepting mistreatment. It's about knowing your worth and acting from that knowledge. That sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty is allowing natural consequences to unfold, and that what you don't know about someone can absolutely destroy you. The irony was suffocating. Victoria's hand had moved to her own belly 17 times today in unconscious protection of the secret growing there. The child she discovered just 3 days ago. The announcement she'd planned to make over the anniversary cake that was now melting on the counter. Jessica leaned into Daniel with practiced intimacy, her engagement ring catching the light, a 3-carat diamond that Daniel had charged to a credit card Victoria's subsidiary bank had approved interest-free, part of the executive benefits package she'd designed to support the Hayes family without their knowledge. Margaret was still recording on her phone, one narrating for her social media followers about putting gold diggers in their place, her voice sharp with vindication as she detailed how the Hayes family was finally free of the woman who'd trapped Daniel. The 3,000 people watching Margaret's live stream had no idea they were witnessing the humiliation of the woman who'd revolutionized global telecommunications, the anonymous founder of 6 Fortune 500 companies, the trillionaire who'd chosen love over power and was now drowning in the consequences of that choice. Victoria's eyes found the family portrait on the wall, the one from last Christmas where Daniel's arm was around her shoulders, but his eyes were looking somewhere else, always somewhere else. Even then planning his exit strategy. Patricia followed her gaze and laughed harder. Woof, that cackling sound that had haunted Victoria through 5 years of degradation, disguised as constructive criticism and helpful suggestions about how Victoria could improve herself to be worthy of the Hayes name. The Hayes name that Victoria had saved from bankruptcy 7 years ago when she'd purchased Summit Global Industries hours before its collapse, restructuring it from the shadows while allowing the Hayes family to believe their legacy had survived through their own merit. Daniel's father had died, never knowing that his company's resurrection had nothing to do with his business acumen and everything to do with the quiet woman his son would eventually marry. The woman who'd fallen in love with Daniel before she'd understood what his love truly cost. Margaret moved closer with her phone, zooming in on Victoria's water-soaked face, capturing the moment for permanent digital record, creating evidence that would soon become Margaret's own destruction, but she was too drunk on cruelty to recognize the danger. Jessica whispered something to Daniel that made him smile. That private smile Victoria had once believed was reserved for her, now understanding it had always been reserved for whoever served his purposes best in that particular moment. Patricia set down her champagne glass and approached Victoria with slow, deliberate steps, her heels clicking against the marble Victoria had selected from Italian quarries, installed by craftsmen Victoria had hired, in a home Victoria owned through a shell corporation, registered in the Cayman Islands. The older woman's face was arranged in false sympathy as she reached out to touch Victoria's shoulder, her voice dripping with condescension as she suggested Victoria accept reality gracefully and move on with her life, because Daniel deserves better than someone who can't even give him children. The statement landed like a physical blow, Patricia condemning Victoria for infertility that didn't exist, while Victoria's hand unconsciously protected the evidence of new life growing beneath her heart. Victoria's hand moved past the unsigned divorce papers in her purse, past the positive pregnancy test she'd wrapped in tissue paper that morning, reaching instead for her phone, the device that contained access to an empire the Hayes family couldn't begin to comprehend. The dirty water had stopped dripping now, pooling around her feet in a circle that looked almost like a barrier between her old life and whatever came next, a baptism in filth that was somehow washing her clean of the illusions she'd clung to for too long. Daniel was getting impatient, his voice rising as he demanded she sign the papers and stop dragging this out, explaining that the moving truck would arrive in an hour to remove her belongings from his penthouse. Belongings he'd mentally cataloged and already dismissed as worthless, compared to the life he was building with Jessica. Patricia nodded in agreement, adding that Victoria should be grateful Daniel was even giving her time to pack, that most men would simply throw her things on the street after 5 years of disappointing their families, completely unaware that the street she referenced was owned by a Victoria's urban development subsidiary that had purchased the entire city block 2 years ago. Margaret's phone was still recording, her followers multiplying as the drama unfolded. People sharing the stream across platforms with comments ranging from support for Daniel to criticism of Victoria's gold digging, none of them recognizing the woman on their screens from the Forbes cover story that had run last month, featuring the anonymous trillionaire, how one woman built 6 empires without anyone knowing her name. Victoria had worn a mask for that photo shoot, her identity protected even in revelation, maintaining the separation between her public power and her private life, a separation that was about to collapse spectacularly. Jessica was examining the apartment now, mentally redecorating, pointing out changes she'd make once that woman finally leaves, treating Victoria as if she'd already vanished, already been erased from Daniel's story. The younger woman paused at the bookshelf, running her fingers along titles Victoria had collected over years of careful study. First editions of economic theory, signed copies of leadership memoirs, texts on corporate strategy that Daniel had never bothered to read, despite Victoria leaving them strategically placed around their home. Victoria's thumb hovered over her phone screen, over the app that didn't exist in any app store, the custom software her security team had built to manage her corporate empire from anywhere in the world. One password would open access to accounts containing more money than Daniel had ever imagined existed, more power than Patricia had ever conceptualized, more control than Margaret had ever dreamed of wielding. The phone screen reflected Victoria's face, water-streaked, mascara running, but her eyes were different now, focused in a way they hadn't been in years. Clarity replacing the hope that had kept her playing a role that was destroying her piece by piece. Daniel noticed her distraction and snapped his fingers in her face. Actually snapped his fingers like she was a servant who'd forgotten her place. The gesture so casually dismissive that Patricia smiled in approval, while Margaret zoomed in to capture it for her audience. Jessica laughed at the finger snap, a tinkling sound that might have been charming in a different context, but here sounded like breaking glass, sharp enough to cut. The dirty water on the floor was reflecting the chandelier above. The Baccarat crystal chandelier Victoria had imported from France, installed as a surprise for Daniel on their second anniversary, and back when she'd still believed his happiness mattered more than her dignity. Patricia was telling a story now, regaling Jessica with tales of Victoria's inadequacies as a Hayes family wife, listing every social misstep and perceived failure with the kind of detail that revealed just how closely Patricia had been monitoring, just how much energy she'd invested in cataloging reasons to reject the woman who'd been subsidizing her entire lifestyle. Margaret added her own commentary, describing how Victoria had never fit in with their social circle, how she'd always been awkward at charity galas, never mentioning that Victoria had anonymously funded 70% of those charities, not that her awkwardness had been the discomfort of watching wealthy people congratulate themselves for donating fractions of what she'd contributed in secret. Daniel checked his watch. Expensive, Swiss-made, a gift from Victoria on his last birthday that he'd accepted without gratitude, as if expensive gifts were simply his due as a Hayes family man. He announced that Victoria had 15 minutes to sign the papers before he called security. Security guards who were actually employed by Victoria's property management company, who received their paychecks from her accounts, who would soon receive very different instructions than Daniel imagined. Jessica was already planning the anniversary party she'd throw next year, describing it to Patricia in detail, and oblivious that the event space she was naming was owned by Victoria's hospitality division, that every vendor she was listing contracted exclusively with Victoria's corporate network. Victoria's finger touched the screen of her phone, entering the first digit of her password, beginning the sequence that would unlock everything, that would transform her from victim to force of nature in the time it took to complete 8 characters. The password completed with a soft chime that only Victoria heard, her phone screen transforming into a dashboard of power that would have stopped Daniel's heart if he'd understood what he was seeing. Numbers scrolled across the display, real-time valuations of her holdings, stock prices adjusting by the second, subsidiary reports flowing in from 17 countries where morning was breaking and her empire was awakening to another day of dominance. Victoria's chief of security, Marcus Reynolds, answered on the first ring, his voice professional and alert despite the late hour, waiting for instructions from the woman who'd built an intelligence network that rivaled government agencies. She spoke quietly, her words deliberate and precise. But Margaret's phone caught fragments of the conversation, and her followers heard Victoria mention Summit Global Industries and immediate termination protocols, phrases that meant nothing to Margaret, but would soon mean everything to the Hayes family watching her stream. Daniel was signing papers at the dining table now, finalizing something with Jessica that involved property transfers and asset divisions, confident he was securing his future while actually signing documents that would soon be worthless when the addresses listed no longer belonged to him. Patricia had moved to the bar, pouring herself another champagne, toasting to new beginnings, and finally getting rid of dead weight, her voice carrying across the penthouse with alcohol-fueled bravado. Jessica was photographing the apartment from different angles, already posting to her own social media about her upgrade to penthouse living, tagging Daniel in romantic captions about finally being with a real man, accumulating likes and congratulations from people who had no idea they were celebrating the beginning of a catastrophe. Victoria ended her call with Marcus and immediately placed another, this one to her chief financial officer, Sarah Chen, whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had made her legendary in corporate circles where Victoria's identity remained protected. The instructions Victoria gave were surgical in their precision. Freeze all Hayes family accounts, revoke all lines of credit, cancel all corporate benefits effective immediately, and begin the legal process of terminating employment contracts for cause. Sarah's voice held a note of satisfaction as she confirmed the orders. Having watched Victoria endure disrespect from the Hayes family for years while maintaining her cover, finally unleashed to execute the consequences Victoria had been preventing. Margaret was still recording, still narrating, but her tone had shifted slightly as she noticed Victoria on the phone. Noticed something in Victoria's posture that didn't match the defeated woman she expected to see. Something that made Margaret's instincts whisper warnings her arrogance was too loud to hear. Daniel glanced over at Victoria and frowned, annoyed that she was wasting time on the phone instead of signing his divorce papers, completely missing the fact that each call Victoria made was dismantling another piece of the life he took for granted. Victoria's third call went to her legal team, 8 attorneys who specialized in corporate law, family law, real estate law, and criminal prosecution, a team she'd assembled over years of careful vetting and astronomical retainer fees. She outlined the situation in calm, measured tones, describing the assault with dirty water, the attempted coercion, the fraud Daniel had committed by claiming ownership of property he didn't own, the defamation occurring in real time on Margaret's social media stream. The lead attorney, James Mitchell, had handled cases against Fortune 100 companies and won judgments that had bankrupted corporations. But even he sounded energized by the scope of what Victoria was unleashing, the comprehensive destruction she was authorizing across every legal avenue available. Patricia noticed Victoria's legal conversation and laughed dismissively, telling Jessica that Victoria was probably calling some strip mall lawyer who couldn't do anything against Hayes family resources that were evaporating with each second that passed. Daniel's phone buzzed, a text message from his assistant at Summit Global Industries, marked urgent, something about systems access being revoked and security protocols activating. He frowned at the screen, confused about why his access would be affected, texting back that there must be some mistake, some technical glitch that IT would resolve in the morning. Margaret's phone buzzed next, then Patricia's, both women receiving similar messages about credentials being disabled, benefits being suspended, corporate accounts being frozen. They exchanged confused glances but dismissed it as a technical error, some company-wide system update that would be fixed by Monday, never imagining that the update was actually an elimination, a purge of the Hayes family from every database in Victoria's empire. Jessica's phone lit up with notifications too: credit card declined, payment processing failed, account suspended for the charges she'd been making all day in anticipation of her new life with Daniel. Victoria placed her fourth call, this one to the building's property management, specifically to the head of security who'd been briefed years ago about Victoria's actual identity in case of emergencies. Her voice remained steady as she explained that Daniel Hayes, Patricia Hayes, Margaret Hayes, Anna and Jessica Cole were trespassing in her private residence and needed to be escorted from the building immediately, that restraining orders were being filed and law enforcement was being contacted. The security chief's confirmation was immediate and professional. A team was already en route to the penthouse, ETA 3 minutes. The elevator chimed and 4 security officers stepped into the penthouse, their presence transforming the atmosphere from celebration to crisis in the seconds it took them to cross the threshold. Daniel turned with irritation ready on his lips, prepared to complain about the interruption, but the words died when the head of security, Thomas Wright, addressed Victoria directly with, "Miss Laurent, we received your call," using the name she'd been born with, the name that appeared on corporate documents across 6 continents, the name the Hayes family had never heard because Victoria had taken Daniel's surname in marriage. Patricia's champagne glass paused halfway to her lips as Thomas continued, explaining that the trespassers would be removed immediately and that NYPD had been notified per her request. Teddy, his tone holding the deference reserved for someone who signed his paychecks, someone whose authority was absolute and unquestionable. Margaret's phone was still recording, still streaming, but her narration had stopped as confusion crept across her face, her followers' comments shifting from support to questions about what was happening, who Victoria Laurent was, why security was treating the gold digger like she owned the building. Daniel found his voice first, a sputtering indignation about how there must be some mistake, how he was the resident here, how Victoria was the one who needed to leave. Thomas didn't even glance at Daniel as he responded, his words precise and devastating. The penthouse was registered to Lorraine Holdings International. Daniel Hayes had no legal claim to the property, and his presence was now considered criminal trespass. Jessica's face had gone pale, her earlier confidence evaporating as she processed the implications, her mind racing through conversations where Daniel had described his family's wealth and corporate connections, realizing she might have bet her future on a man who owned nothing. Patricia set down her champagne glass with a trembling hand, her voice sharp but uncertain as she demanded to know what kind of scam Victoria was running, what kind of fraud she'd committed to confuse the security system, still unable to conceive that the woman she'd mocked for 5 years might actually hold power over her. Victoria's phone buzzed with incoming confirmations. The Hayes family employment contracts had been terminated, their corporate credit cards declined, their stock options voided, or their retirement accounts frozen pending legal review of fraudulent expense claims spanning 3 years. Margaret's social media stream was exploding now, thousands of viewers searching Victoria Laurent and flooding the comments with links to articles about the mysterious trillionaire, connecting the dots between the woman Margaret had just humiliated and the business titan who'd revolutionized 3 industries before turning 30. Someone posted a side-by-side comparison of Victoria soaking wet in the penthouse and a masked photo from Forbes, the similarity in posture and presence undeniable to anyone looking closely. Daniel's phone was ringing continuously now. Calls from colleagues at Summit Global Industries, the messages about emergency terminations and immediate asset seizures. His professional network dissolving in real time as word spread through the corporate ecosystem that the Hayes family had committed professional suicide. Thomas gestured to his team and they moved with practiced efficiency, positioning themselves near each trespasser, ready to escort them out but waiting for Victoria's explicit command. She stood in her dirty, water-soaked dress, her hair still dripping, her makeup ruined, but her spine was straight and her eyes held something that made Daniel take an involuntary step backward. Patricia tried one more time to assert dominance, her voice rising as she threatened to call her lawyers, to sue Victoria for harassment, to destroy her reputation across their social circles. Victoria's response was quiet, almost gentle, as she explained that Patricia's lawyers were actually employed by firms Victoria's corporate legal department had on retainer, that Patricia's social circles were funded by Victoria's charitable foundations, that Patricia's reputation was currently being demolished in real time across Margaret's social media stream, where 17,000 people were now watching. The older woman's face crumpled as understanding began to penetrate years of willful ignorance, as she realized the charity case she'd tormented had been subsidizing her entire existence. Jessica was crying now, her carefully constructed future collapsing as Daniel's phone displayed another notification. His personal bank accounts were frozen due to fraudulent deposits from accounts he didn't control, deposits Victoria had been making to support his lifestyle while he cheated. Margaret's hand was shaking as she held her phone, reading comments from her followers who'd identified Victoria, who were posting screenshots of Victoria's corporate achievements, who were turning Margaret into a cautionary tale about hubris and cruelty being broadcast to permanent digital record. Daniel's eyes met Victoria's across the room, and for the first time in their marriage, he actually saw her, saw the intelligence he'd dismissed as irrelevant, saw the power he'd never imagined existed, saw the woman he'd kicked out on their anniversary finally stepping into the truth she'd hidden for his sake. Victoria's hand moved to her belly in that unconscious protective gesture, her fingers resting over the child Daniel would never know, and the heir to an empire he'd just forfeited through his own arrogance. Thomas waited patiently for her signal, for the word that would remove the Hayes family from her property and her life permanently. Margaret's phone captured the moment. Victoria standing in a puddle of dirty water, her ruined dress clinging to her frame, but her eyes holding something that looked like freedom, like the terrible beauty of consequences finally arriving. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to beg, perhaps to negotiate, but Victoria raised one hand to stop him, her voice steady as she gave Thomas the confirmation he was waiting for. "Remove them." The security team moved with synchronized precision, each officer guiding a trespasser toward the elevator, professional and impersonal as they executed Victoria's orders. Patricia was protesting, her voice escalating into hysteria as she was escorted past the artwork she'd helped select, past the furniture she'd rearranged, through the home she'd treated as partially hers without ever understanding who actually paid for everything. Margaret's phone was still recording as she was guided out, her stream capturing her own removal, her followers witnessing the exact moment when cruelty met consequence and shattered. Jessica was silent, her tears streaming as she passed Victoria without making eye contact, her engagement ring suddenly feeling heavy with the weight of a future that no longer existed. Daniel was last, his feet moving reluctantly toward the elevator, his mind clearly racing through options and finding nothing. No leverage, no escape route, no way to undo what he'd done. He stopped at the threshold and turned back to Victoria, his mouth opening with words that never came, because Victoria spoke first, her voice carrying across the penthouse with perfect clarity. "You kicked out your pregnant wife on your anniversary to marry your mistress while your mother laughed and your sister poured dirty water on me, and you did it all in a home I owned, in a life I built, surrounded by a family I supported, never knowing that everything you thought was yours was actually mine." The words hung in the air like a verdict, like an epitaph for a marriage that had been dead longer than either of them had admitted. Daniel's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, calculation, fear, before settling on something that looked almost like recognition, like he was finally understanding what he'd lost. So the elevator doors closed on the Hayes family and Jessica, sealing them away from the penthouse, from the life they'd taken for granted, from the woman they'd underestimated so catastrophically. Victoria stood alone in her home, water still pooling at her feet, her phone buzzing with updates about legal filings and asset seizures and corporate announcements that would make headlines by morning. She walked to the window overlooking the city, her city, the skyline dotted with buildings she owned and companies she controlled and power she'd built from nothing. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman transformed, not by revenge exactly, but by the act of finally stopping, of finally letting people experience the natural consequences of their choices, of finally choosing herself over the hope that they might change. Outside, 17 floors below, Daniel Hayes stood on the sidewalk with his mother, his sister, and his mistress, their phones all ringing with calls from creditors and colleagues and connections who'd already heard the news spreading through corporate networks like wildfire. Margaret's social media stream had been shared 40,000 times, watched by hundreds of thousands of people who were dissecting every frame, identifying every moment of cruelty, turning the Hayes family into a cautionary tale that would echo through business schools and ethics courses for years to come. Patricia was trying to call her lawyers and discovering that her retainer had been paid with money from Victoria's accounts, that her legal representation had evaporated along with everything else. Jessica was realizing that her pregnancy announcement to Daniel had been a lie designed to secure commitment, and that lies had a way of multiplying until they buried everyone involved. Daniel looked up at the penthouse windows, 17 floors above, where lights were going out one by one as Victoria moved through rooms he'd never see again. His phone displayed another notification. Summit Global Industries had released a statement announcing leadership changes and organizational restructuring, corporate language for the purge he'd triggered by kicking out the woman who owned everything. The moving truck he'd ordered pulled up to the curb, the driver looking confused when Daniel explained there was nothing to move, that plans had changed, that everything was different now. Margaret was reading comments on her stream, watching her follower count drop as people unfollowed in disgust, as brands she'd partnered with began terminating contracts, as her influencer career died in real time, because she'd chosen to broadcast cruelty and discovered that consequences could travel at the speed of the internet. Patricia was crying now, mascara running down her face just like Victoria's had been. But there was no one left to mock her tears, no audience to appreciate her suffering. The four of them stood on the sidewalk as light rain began to fall, mixing with their tears and their regrets, washing nothing clean because some stains go deeper than water can reach. Daniel's hands were shaking as he refreshed his bank account and saw the balance that couldn't be real. Zeros where there should have been millions. Frozen where there should have been accessible. Gone where there should have been security. His mind was trying to calculate how to fix this, how to negotiate, how to apologize his way back to stability. But every scenario ended in the same realization. He declared war on an empire he hadn't known existed, and empires don't negotiate with people who betray them. Above them, Victoria stood at her window with one hand on her belly, feeling the flutter of life growing there. The child who would inherit everything she'd built and never know the father who'd abandoned them both. Her phone rang, Marcus Reynolds confirming that restraining orders had been filed, that legal teams were coordinating across 8 jurisdictions, that the systematic dismantling of the Hayes family's financial life was proceeding exactly as planned. She approved each action with quiet efficiency, not from anger exactly, but from the clarity that comes when you finally stop protecting people from themselves. The dirty water had dried on her skin, but she hadn't changed clothes yet, wearing the evidence of their cruelty like armor, like proof that she'd survived what they'd tried to do to her. Tomorrow the news would break, headlines about the mysterious trillionaire finally revealed, about the corporate dynasty exposed, about the family who'd kicked out the woman who owned their entire world. Tomorrow Daniel would try to salvage something from the wreckage, would discover that Victoria had been 12 steps ahead for years, that every account he thought was his was actually hers, that every achievement he'd claimed was actually orchestrated by the wife he'd discarded. Tomorrow Margaret's video would go viral in a different way, becoming a teaching moment about the dangers of cruelty and the certainty of consequences. Tomorrow Patricia would realize that the social circles she'd wielded like weapons were closing ranks against her, that reputation mattered and hers was destroyed beyond repair. But tonight Victoria stood in her penthouse alone, watching the city lights reflect off rain-slicked streets, feeling her child move inside her, planning the empire she would build for them both. She wasn't bankrupt or shaking in fear. That fate belonged to Daniel now, to the man who'd kicked out his pregnant wife on their anniversary and discovered too late that some betrayals cost everything. The dirty water Margaret had poured on her had washed away the last of Victoria's mercy, baptizing her into something stronger than she'd been, just something the Hayes family would spend years regretting they'd created. And somewhere 17 floors below, Daniel was beginning to understand what she'd always known. That power hidden becomes power multiplied, and that underestimating someone is the most expensive mistake you can ever make.